Good morning. I am here today to share with you from Ching, chapter 22, which in the Regina Akers translation is titled The Return. Brokenness will be made whole. Crookedness will be straightened. Hollowness will be filled. Worn out will be revitalized. What's missing will be gained. Glut will cease to make sense. Sages embrace the one, and therefore are models for the world. They do not focus on themselves, and so they shine. They do not exist for themselves, and so they are clear. They do not judge themselves, and so they have merit. They do not boast about themselves, and so they endure. Sages do not argue, so no one in the world can argue with them. It is as ancient wisdom says, brokenness shall be made whole. How could these be empty words? Truly, wholeness is the return. So we're going to look at the translation of this chapter because, as almost always with the Tao Te Ching, the translation is quite interesting. So this is chapter 22. And the first three characters in particular are something that I want to look at. These first three characters, bent, standard, whole. Not only are they the first three characters of the chapter, but if we scroll down near the end, we find the same characters right here, bent, standard, whole. And then this last character is emphasizing it. So it's emphasizing bent, standard, whole. So the entire chapter is sandwiched between these three characters, which means these three characters are the overall meaning of the entire chapter. So how we translate them is pretty important. And right up front, I'm going to tell you, people do not translate them the same way. So let's just look at this a little bit. We could spend an hour or more looking at how people translate it, but we'll just look at it a little bit to give you a general idea of what's going on here. So these are the three characters, bent, standard, whole. The first character has a couple of meanings, the first of which is tune and song, and no one uses that meaning. Everyone pays attention to the second meaning of the same character. Bent, crooked, or wrong. And for the most part, people translated it as either bent or crooked, usually bent. Bent, crooked, or wrong. And then the next character, standard, norm, or rule. That's the primary way people translate it. Occasionally, you might see someone use the word then. And then this last character, we looked at this last character when we were looking at chapter 16. This character can translate as all, whole, entire, complete. And if I click on that, you might remember this character. It's made up of two radicals, enter, king. And during chapter 16, we talked about this enter king character, which could be translated as whole or complete, And we said it really means entering the supreme state, right? Because a king is a supreme ruler. So if we go back and look at this translation, it says, in effect, bent, standard, whole. So what does that mean? Well, this is where this middle character becomes very important. How you interpret the meaning of this middle character. A standard, a norm, and a rule are basically the same thing. A standard is a rule that people normally follow, right? So the question here is, what does that mean in this particular sentence when it says bent, standard, whole? And people really interpreted this in a couple of different ways. People interpreted this as saying bent, standard, now. Bent is the standard, and therefore there is whole. And some people interpreted it as in the future, bent, and then the standard will become whole. Whole will be the new standard. Bent is the old standard, we could say, and whole is the new standard. Let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. I'm going to share a couple of different translations of this first line. The first one is by Derek Lynn. And Derek Lynn in chapter 22 says, yield and remain whole. Now he translated this as yield, and he's not the only one. Some people saw bent here as meaning not rigid, right? Being flexible or yielding. But what I really want to focus on is how he interpreted this standard character. He said, and remain whole. In other words, he's saying that this standard is the current standard. Wholeness is the current standard. And if you are flexible, if you yield, you will remain whole. He also said for the next line, bend and remain straight. And we'll look at that in a moment. But notice he interpreted this first as remain. But interesting, the next two lines also use this character. And in the next two lines, he did not interpret it as is standard. He interpreted it as a future standard. He says, below and become filled, right? Then the standard will be filled. Be worn out and become renewed. So Derek Lynn, in his own translation, interpreted the word standard in some cases as this is the standard, wholeness is the standard, and in some cases as if you do this, you can become this. This can become the new standard. So one of the things that I needed to do was I needed to determine how I was going to interpret this standard. And if we look back, we'll notice that I considered chapters 4, 5, and 16 as I made this decision. So let me share with you what I was recalling from chapters 4, 5, and 16 when I made my decision. First of all, chapter 4 says, this is the middle verse of chapter 4, the way is profound. It is the ancestor of everything. It will diminish your sharpened sense of self. It will eliminate your confusion. It will merge divine nature with your human nature. So what this is pointing to is, if you follow the way, if you come into harmony with the way, this is going to, these will be the results. This is going to diminish your sharpened sense of self, right? This is going to eliminate your confusion. In fact, this is why it's called the way, right? This is the way to enlightenment. If we look at chapter 5, the middle verse says, isn't the space between heaven and earth like a bellows? It is empty and never changes. yet it moves and heals and continually produces. And then chapter 16 is about the way of enlightenment, which shows this path that you can follow from stillness to life, to constant, to wisdom, to equanimity, to wholeness, or the supreme state, which is enlightenment. So these chapters seem to be pointing towards a progressive awakening, or a progressive healing, or a progressive return to the natural supreme state of the Tao. And that's how I interpreted standard. So if we go back and look at my translation again, bent, standard, whole. I really translated as bent will be made whole. But then what I had to do is choose an English word for this bent. And again, if you go through many different translations, you'll find that people used many different words for this bent. Very rarely, in fact, do people use the word bent. And I think the reason that they don't, it's the same reason that I didn't, is because, for example, here, crooked and straight, you see our opposites. You go from crooked to straight. You go from hollow to full. You go from shabby to new. Bent to whole doesn't seem to fit. So it seems like maybe Lao Tzu meant something else by bent. Now, again, some people translated that as flexible or yielding or even surrender. But other people translated it differently. For example, even one person translated it as crippled, or some people translated it as incomplete. I really took this whole first part of this chapter into consideration. I translated the other lines and then came back to this one. And I looked at these other words like crooked, hollow, shabby, black, right? And what I began to see as a possible good English translation, which would be the opposite of whole, is brokenness. And when something is bent, if it's supposed to be straight, you might say, hey, this is broken. You know, like if you had a spoon, for example, or a fork that was bent, you know, there's something wrong here, right? This fork isn't going to work like this. And in fact, if we go back and we look at the dictionary, wrong, there's something wrong here, was one of the definitions of that word. Bent, crooked, wrong. So as an opposite to whole, with the meaning bent, crooked, and wrong, and taking into account the context of the entire first part of the chapter, brokenness seemed like a good way to translate this. Brokenness will be made whole. And by brokenness here, it just means things aren't right. Things aren't right on the macro level, the way the government is functioning, the way the people are being, and things aren't right on the micro level, the way we feel inside. You know, there's something wrong with everything. We are out of harmony, but out of harmony will be corrected. And that's what brokenness will be made whole meant to me. And so that's how I translated it. The next line was a little easier. Crooked, standard, straight. Crookedness will be straightened. Now, crookedness here can be on both the macro and the micro level. But this is a chapter of hope. You know, this is speaking to the people who are seeing something is wrong here, right? Something is wrong here. It needs to be corrected. And so looking out, this sentence might imply, yes, there is something wrong here. You can see it. You can see, for example, that the government is corrupt. corrupt, or many of the officials are corrupt. You see the thievery that is going on among the people. Once this brokenness is made whole, once we come back into alignment with the Tao, all of that's going to be straightened out. Everything's going to be taken care of. So brokenness, the internal personal brokenness, will be made whole. And then as a result, as we individually come into harmony with the Tao, the external crookedness will be straightened. Hollow, standard, full. Hollowness will be filled. You know, we have internal emotional feelings of lack. It could be a lack of connection with others. It could be a lack of purpose. Again, there's an internal hollowness here that as we come back into harmony with the Tao, it will be filled. Worn out will be revitalized. This could just be being tired of life, tired of the drudgery of the day, tired of the way of the world, right? When we come back into harmony with the Tao, that worn outness is going to be revitalized, turned into happiness, joy, acceptance. Lack, standard, gain. What's missing, what is lacking, will be gained. And that is true understanding of the way things are. That is love of all things. That is awareness of the Tao, right? All of that spiritual fulfillment, all of that we need to be truly fulfilled will be gained. And much, standard, confused, or puzzled, I translated as glut, glut being the root word of gluttony. Glut will cease to make sense. Or having more than one needs will cease to make sense. And in fact, what we find is as we awaken more and more, having more than we need can start to feel like a burden. It really does cease to make sense. When we have this hollowness, often we try and fill it with material things, with external experiences, right? We're trying to fill this hollowness. But once the hollowness is filled, we don't need those things anymore. So glut ceases to make sense. This is a chapter of hope. This is a promise about the healing that occurs, the fulfillment that occurs as we bring ourselves back into the harmony with the Tao. Brokenness will be made whole. Crookedness will be straightened. Hollowness will be filled. Worn out will be revitalized. What's missing will be gained, and glut will cease to make sense. Now, the next section of this chapter. Therefore, sage, person, hold, one. That's what the Chinese characters mean. And then do, whole world, pattern, or style. This pattern really means that it's something to be followed. Like if you're making clothing and you're using a pattern, you follow the pattern to make the clothing. So the sage here, because the sage is holding to the one, the sage is a pattern for the whole world to follow. That's what this is saying. So I translated it as sages embrace the one, meaning the Tao. This is what they are focused on. And therefore they are models for the world. So how do we gain the standards that are promised in this first verse? The answer to that question is we model ourselves after the sages. We follow the sages They are the pattern, right? We use them. We can't see the Tao, but we can see the sage. So we follow their way of being, and we try to mature that way of being within ourselves. So what is that way of being? Well, we have seen it before, such as in chapter 15, but here it's stated again. First of all, no self appear, therefore bright. This focus on myself isn't there for the sages. No self appear. They aren't focused on themselves, which is exactly how I translated it. They do not focus on themselves, therefore bright, and so they shine. What this means, of course, is that the sage is not self-absorbed, right? The sage is focused on, well, really the Tao. But by being focused on the Tao, the sage is focused on that which is greater than the individual self. The sage has compassion for the whole. The sage is outer focused isn't the right word because they're focused on the Tao, but the appearance that we see in them is they are more concerned about others, more concerned about the whole than they are for themselves. And because they are concerned about the whole, they shine, right? People notice that. People notice the difference between being self-absorbed and being focused on the whole. They do not focus on themselves, and so they shine. No self is, this was no self appear, this is no self is, therefore clear. Is, I translate it as exist. They do not exist for themselves, and so they are clear. This really just follows the first sentence here. They aren't focused on themselves, right? They do not exist for themselves. When we exist for ourselves, we are focused on ourselves. And really what we're focused on are our thoughts about ourselves. We're focused on our desires, our expectations, how we want things to be, self-will. And when we're focused on self-will, we are not at all clear. Sages are the opposite. They do not exist for themselves. They are not concerned about the desires that may show up in this mind or the thoughts about how things should be that may show up in this mind. They're not existing for all of that. And because those confused thoughts of self-will are not important to them, they are able to be clear. They are able to see things as they really are instead of through the distorted filter of self-will. Now, the next two lines were very interesting. People translated them differently. So I am going to copy them and put them into my dictionary. No, self, and then this next character could mean to cut down. It could mean to attack, and it can also mean to boast. And so what's happening is that some people translated this character more like I did, which was really following to cut down or to attack. And some people translated this character to boast, which really is kind of the opposite. If I am attacking myself or I am boasting about myself, at least externally, those things look very different. Now, I will tell you, internally, they aren't different. Because when we are boasting, the real reason we are boasting is that we have a background egoic voice that is attacking us. For example, the background egoic voice may be you're stupid, you're a loser, you're a fake. And the way I am trying to overcompensate for that is by telling everybody how smart I am, boasting about my successes, right? So really they aren't different, but they appear different, right? Whether I am attacking myself internally, telling myself what a loser I am, or whether I'm boasting externally, telling you how great I am, they appear to be different. Now, what's interesting is this character, again, means to cut down, to attack, to boast. If we go to the next line, we have another character. We start off with the same two characters, no self. And then we have this character, which is a different character. It means to boast. To sympathize is another way this is translated. But if we hop over to another dictionary, what we find, again, the first character is cut down, subjugate, attack. And then the second character could also mean pity, feel sorry for, show sympathy. And this one doesn't say boast, although here it did. So you can see how people may have translated these characters a little differently. In some cases, people translated the first character to mean boast, and then the second character to mean more like pity or feel sorry for. In my case, I translated the first character to mean self-attack or cutting oneself down. And the second character I translated as boasting. So again, people sometimes did these a little differently, and you can see why. If we go back to my translation, again, I chose no self-attack, right? The sages do not attack themselves, or the way I translated it was, they do not judge themselves. Therefore have merit, and so they have merit. Now, what this translation, what this sentence really means is, because they are not listening to those attacking thoughts, you're such a loser, you can't do anything, you're a stupid idiot, right? Those thoughts hold us back from what the Tao might do through us. You know, if we have guidance, for example, to start an organization, you know, like I did, starting Awakening Together. And yet there's all of these thoughts about how we can't do it, how we don't know anything, what an idiot we are. That could hold us back from following the guidance. But if we are not listening to those types of thoughts, we follow that guidance, right? The Tao is able to move through us. And so, meritorious service, right? Achievements, not through the person, but achievements through the Tao are able to occur. So sages do not judge themselves, and so they have merit. They're able to be moved by the Tao. The Tao can accomplish through them as vessels. And then the next line, no self-boast, therefore long. They do not boast about themselves, and so they endure. They don't claim these achievements as their own. They don't say, I started this organization, I wrote this book, I helped this person solve these problems, right? They're humble. They know it wasn't them. They know that their focus is emptiness. Their focus is being in harmony with the Tao. And anything that occurs through them came from the Tao. And this is why they're able to endure. It's through their emptiness that the Tao moves them to do this, and then this, and then this. And they're not claiming any of that. We've seen this before as we've read the Tao, right? And so they continue to be useful by the Tao. Now, this next set of characters, man only, we've seen this before. Man only is really just a way of pointing back to who we're already talking about. So we're talking about the sages. So this isn't, man only here does not mean male, right? It's just pointing back to who we're already talking about, the sages. Only, no well, sorry, man only is a part of that. So no argue. This could also be no contend, or this could be no strive. And again, people interpreted it differently, translated it differently. Certainly, it makes sense that sages do not strive, because doing without doing is a core teaching of the Tao Te Ching, right? You aren't doing it, the Tao is doing it. So if I was looking at just the first part of the sentence, sages do not strive would make perfect sense. But the second part of the sentence says, therefore, whole world, there is none who together with him, her. If I was to use the word strive, then what this sentence would say is, sages do not strive, so no one in the world can strive with them. And maybe that is true. That's how some people translated it. Maybe because they are patterns for the world, when they are doing without doing, there can't be anyone around them that is doing, right? However, it felt better to me to translate the word as argue, especially since argue and contend, which really kind of means argue, to contend with someone. It felt better to translate this as argue, and that sentence makes really good sense. Sages do not argue, so no one in the world can argue with them. I learned a long time ago in my own spiritual development that an argument requires two parties. For example, I had a teenage daughter, and anyone who's had a teenage daughter knows that teenage daughters naturally go through this process. This is happening within them. It's a natural process that comes from the Tao. Just like it's natural for babies to learn to walk, it is natural for these teenage daughters who are maturing to start breaking away from their parents. Nature is preparing them, you could say, to be a parent themselves, right? To be an adult themselves. And so when they're going through this stage of breaking away from their parents, there can be lots of arguing, lots of contending, right? Lots of rebellion, we sometimes call it. And what I learned was that when my daughter began the argument only continued if I participated. What I learned was if I didn't participate, if I focused on the emptiness of the Tao, that the argument just kind of fizzled away. It couldn't happen. I started to see arguments as like playing ping pong, right? In order to argue, one person hits the ball, then the other person has to hit it back. Then, it goes back and forth. I would have to be defending myself. I would have to be disagreeing. I would have to think, I am right, you are wrong. All of this in some way would need to be there in order for the argument to continue. But if I dropped into emptiness and I did none of that, the argument just fizzled away. So this sentence is a truth. Sages do not argue, so no one in the world can argue with them. And now we're back to the top again. Ancient of actually say. It is as ancient wisdom says. Here's these three characters again: bent, standard, whole, or supreme state. Bent, standard, supreme state, and then emphasis, or I wrote commanded. It is as ancient wisdom says. Brokenness shall here was my commanded or emphasis. Anybody who knows legal language knows that shall is stronger than will. Brokenness shall be made whole. This is an absolute promise. We bring ourselves into accord with the Tao, and that brokenness shall be made whole. Not maybe, right? It's commanded. How empty words, exclamation point. How could these be empty words? How could this promise not be fulfilled? This commanded promise, how could this not be fulfilled? Honest, true, whole, and return of. Truly, Wholeness is the return. And you'll notice I used chapter 16 and chapter 19 to help me contemplate this. Chapter 16, again, was the return to enlightenment, which says things like, humanity and all things diverse and varied return to their root. To return to the root is called stillness. To be still is called returning to life. To return to life is called constant. To know constant is called wisdom. To know constant is to allow. To allow is to have equanimity. To have equanimity is to be whole or to enter the supreme state. And to be whole is to be enlightened. You can see how that's a return. Wholeness is the return to the Tao. But also, chapter 18 talked about the degradation of society when we don't follow the Tao. And chapter 19, which I called Empower a Strong Culture, pointed back to the possibility of rebuilding a strong culture as a leader as you bring yourself back in harmony with the Tao. So by bringing yourself back to the supreme state, there's a return of all of society, which is really what the first two lines seem to say, right? Your personal brokenness will be made whole, and then the overall crookedness will be straightened. So this last sentence, I think, has a double meaning, right? You will become enlightened as you bring yourself back into harmony with the Tao. And, again, we're talking to leaders. As the leader becomes enlightened, this is going to bring all of society back into harmony with the Tao, which is another major theme in the Tao Te Ching. So that is chapter 22, which is a very exciting chapter. Let me read chapter 22 from another translation. Now, you may remember that when we were looking at the chapter I called Dare to be Different, which I believe was chapter 20. Yes, chapter 20. That one of the things I did was I decided to look up the oldest English translation of the Tao that I could find. And I found one from the 19th century by a missionary by the names of James Legge. Well, recently, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Amazon. I wasn't even looking for the Tao Te Ching. I don't remember what I was looking for, something practical around the household that I needed. And you know how Amazon makes suggestions. It suggested this little Tao Te Ching book. Doesn't say, of course, on the front who the author is. I read a couple reviews. People seem to love this little Tao Te Ching book, so I ordered it. And when it came, I opened it up and I was looking to see who the translator was. This is James Legge's translation. So now I have it, and I'm very excited to have what so far is the oldest English translation of the Tao that I've been able to find. So I'm going to read chapter 22 from James Legge's translation to you. It's a little different from mine. So where I said brokenness will become whole, James Legge said the partial becomes complete. But notice that word that could be bent or crooked or wrong was translated as partial. And then we've seen that supreme state, enter king character can mean whole. It can also mean complete. So just like I found brokenness as the opposite to whole, because bent by itself wasn't really fitting, he found partial as the opposite of complete. The partial becomes complete. The crooked, straight. The empty, full. The worn out, new. He whose are few, get them. And he put in parentheses desires. Now, what this said in Chinese was lack standard gain. And we all have to determine what lack standard gain means. And the way I translated that is what's missing will be gained. What seems to be lacking, that spiritual understanding, right? That spiritual fulfillment, that will be gained. He translated it, he whose, in parentheses, desires are few gets them. And the next line, he whose desires are many goes astray. That's when it said something about much becomes confused. And I translated that as glut will cease to make sense. He said, he whose, in parentheses, desires are many goes astray. Therefore, the sage holds in his embrace, he said, the one thing. And then he put in parentheses, that's humility. It just said the sage holds to the one, and I interpreted that one as the great one, the Tao. He interpreted as one thing, and then somehow came to the decision that the one thing was humility. Therefore, the sage holds in his embrace the one thing of humility and manifests it to the whole world. He is free from self-display, and therefore he shines. From self-assertion, and therefore he is distinguished. From self-boasting, and therefore his merit is acknowledged. That's where I chose self-attack, and I called it judgment. But remember, I showed you boast was one of the options. He chose boast. From self-complacency, right? And therefore he acquires superiority. It is because he is thus free from striving that therefore no one in the world is able to strive with him. And I chose the word argue. That saying of the ancients, that the partial becomes complete, was not vainly spoken. All real completion is comprehended under it, right? If you contemplate this sentence, the partial becomes complete. All real completion is understood by knowing what that sentence means. So that's James Lege's translation of that chapter. So now what we need is an assignment, and I'm going to share my screen again as I share the assignment. We're going to focus, this sentence says, sages embrace the one and therefore are models for the world. We're going to look at how the sages are, and our assignment is going to be to model ourselves after them, right? Like they are our pattern. So they do not focus on themselves. They do not exist for themselves. They do not judge themselves. They do not boast about themselves, and they do not argue. All of the following sentences, like they do not argue, they do not boast, they do not judge, they do not exist for themselves, all of that rolls up into the first sentence. They do not focus on themselves, right? If I am existing for myself, if I am trying to get my way, right, that's existing for myself, I'm really focusing on myself, aren't I? If I am listening to those internal attack thoughts and judging myself, I am focused on myself. If I am overcompensating for those attack thoughts and I am boasting about myself, I am focused on myself. And if I'm in an argument and I am defending myself, or I'm trying to convince somebody I'm right, I am focused on myself. So all of those sentences roll up into, sages do not focus on themselves, and so they shine. So that leads to our assignment. Our assignment is to notice when focusing on myself is happening and see if I can just let that go. See that maybe as the crookedness that needs to be straightened at a micro level, right? Just let it go. So if I hear these attack thoughts, you're a loser, you're no good, you'll never be able to do that. By listening to these thoughts, I am focusing on myself. I'm just going to let that go. I don't want to focus on myself. You can return your attention to the Tao, to emptiness, just to the moment, right? Listening to the birds or listening to what someone else is saying to you or anything but focusing on me, right? Whatever is easiest for you. If I find I want to tell people how great I am, or I'm hoping they will give me credit for something that I've done, that's a way of focusing on myself. I want to let that go and return my attention to something other than myself. If I'm trying to defend myself in an argument, well, here's why I did that, or an excuse for why I am late, or anything along those lines. Look for ways that you are focusing on yourself. And realize that when we focus on ourselves, we keep me at the center of my universe. And if me is at the center of my universe, I cannot be aware of the Tao. Me as the center of the universe is the primary obstacle to the Tao, right? We saw that in an earlier chapter where Lao Tzu explained that the biggest trouble was overemphasizing the self. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to make efforts to shift away from overemphasizing the self. So enjoy that assignment. Do it lightheartedly. And I will see you when I come back to look at chapter 23. Bye.